unlocking US market access, regulatory, reimbursement, and your first customers.
Hi everyone, Blythe Karow here from the Karow Advisory Group. I also founded and authored the Device Files, which is a weekly Substack on all things US market commercialization in medtech and wearables, giving updates on FDA, CMS, things like that as well. And through the Karow Advisory Group, I help companies with those same topics. I've done about 25 years in medtech in the US, getting products to market, everything from really understanding that voice of customer, integrating it into the product design, and then making sure your entire commercialization strategy is figured out. And on the panel today, I know we already had an introduction, but we'll let each person go through and introduce themselves and why they're on this panel. So, Danielle.
Hi, thanks for having me, everyone. I'm Danielle Cepega. I'm a member in Cozen's Healthcare Life Sciences Department. So Cozen O'Connor is a full-service firm, over 1,000 lawyers and about 28 different offices. In the Healthcare Life Sciences group, we focus on everything from traditional healthcare, so think physician practices, health systems, reimbursement, fraud and abuse, all the way to the life sciences end, things like FDA regulatory strategy, digital health. You know, I started my career early on in an academic medical center, actually. I was in-house with Penn Medicine up in Philadelphia, and then slowly I've kind of made my way over into the more life sciences heavy space. So I was really excited to be asked to speak on this panel because I think, especially reimbursement, that was something that I focused on very early on, obviously on the hospital physician side, but reimbursement is something that's not focused on early enough, I think, especially for early stage companies who are just getting started. So thank you so much for having me here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And Angela.
Hi, I'm Angela Paterson. I'm a quality regulatory clinical consultant with 29 years experience. I started off in a sort of weird situation in a company in Scotland where the guy that ran the quality regulatory department was you learn everything by being thrown in at the deep end. So you became a jack of all trades, everything from quality systems, technical files, 510Ks, clinical trials, validations, you name it, did it. So the result is a weird list of experiences where people say, how can you possibly know all that? And it just came from 15 years of being taught by a crazy man to do absolutely everything.
I think that's startup life, huh?
That is startup life, and that was a massive company that I worked for at the time. And what that has done is, as a consultant, it's made me really in a good position to work with the one-person company, the startup, the people that are coming out of the universities and things like that. And that really is where my passion is to help these people to get these really innovative products to market as fast as possible.
Mercè?
Yes, so good morning, everyone. My name is Mercè Guerra, and I'm working at Alira Health, which is a global consultancy focused on healthcare products. My role is an associate director in the regulatory medtech department, so I share some, capabilities with Angel, just, helping companies to achieve regulatory compliance either in Europe or in the US by the FDA. And then with my colleagues at Alira Health, we cover like the full cycle development of products with market access insights. We have also a management consulting department, a clinical CRO, and again, just trying to help companies to put their product on the market.
Great. And our last is Jose.
Good morning. Great to be here. So I'm a practicing physician. I'm an electrophysiologist, so just heart rhythm problems. And looking at workflow challenges and evolving workflows, and I started a company focused on real-world evidence that now evolved from a preclinical animal lab to clinical trials and real-world evidence. And then most recently launched a venture studio with my partners that are here, really trying to get clinicians and connected with startups. That's New Pulse Capital.
All right, great. So a little bit more about the panel. I think those of us that are here on stage feel a little bit like a broken record sometimes, trying to tell people how early you have to incorporate different parts of your strategy. I talk about it a lot on the device files. You can aim for market, and I think if you're in the prior panel, you heard Cody talk about a little bit how he hadn't really thought through the reimbursement side, and so he's still learning now to a certain extent and aiming in that direction. But it's not just reimbursement. We will talk about reimbursement, but there's a lot of blind spots and gotchas out there that you need to be thinking about early on, because each one of them can pivot where you're aiming commercially and how you're aiming commercially. It can even come back into your product design, into your clinical trials. So I wanted to just start, Mercè, if you could walk us through some of the different pitfalls that you see different companies, early startups are potentially missing when they're doing their initial strategy.
Yeah, sure. So something that we common see when we're helping, our clients, like drafting the strategies, is that we see that they already have a strategy probably already drafted, but these strategies just focus on one goal, which is achieving regulatory compliance. And I mean, I'm a regulatory person, and I know how important is this, achieving FDA clearance or the CE mark in Europe. But I think that companies, let's say, have to shift in the sense that you don't have to build this strategy around just one audience, which is the regulator. I do think that, getting the clearance is just the starting line, but getting this approval will not guarantee that your product is then approved, that is used, by the healthcare professionals, that is reimbursed, paid, etc. So what we're trying to emphasize to our clients is that they really need to understand all the needs from the different audiences that we're targeting. First, the patients, what they really need. Are we really improving their lives with the device that we are providing? Or maybe we're adding something that is more burdensome. And we really have to understand this, because maybe, this will have an impact on the design of the device and then, of course, regulatory and other aspects. We really need to understand as well the needs from the clinicians, how the clinical, workflow is working here in the United States, but also in Europe. We have a lot of different healthcare systems across Europe, and you really need to understand that as well. And of course, then we need to understand all the reimbursement pathways that could apply to this device. Because at the end, you have to, get all these insights. And I do really think that we need to try to build these integrated strategies from the beginning, as you were saying. Because otherwise, we treat them like as completely separate, entities. And this frequently leads up, to the duplication of clinical evidence that maybe you have to generate because you did not consider, some endpoints that could be relevant from the payers. And of course, this leads to more money, longer timelines, etc. So if I'm trying to, the message that maybe I'm trying to say is that I think it is very important that from the beginning, we understand we ask the right questions to all the audiences that we have to target. We understand their needs, and we're incorporating, to this overall regulatory strategy, regulatory/strategic strategy. And this is something that, it seems obvious, but it doesn't happen. And as I was saying before, we usually see that everything is built like achieving regulatory compliance, which is fine, but then you forgot about the other aspects. So this is something that we are trying, to help our clients with, and, getting people involved from the very beginning, from the different, audiences that we have to target.
Yeah, it's a good list. And I think one of the things that's daunting to a lot of people who have startups is that sounds like a lot of work and a lot of money to be spending on a lot of specialists, right? But I think, what a lot of people on this panel recognize is you can start layering in the analysis and the insight, and having a partner that understands how to work with a startup where maybe your first stage isn't full-blown market access study of $120,000, but you can start talking about your health economic arguments that you're going to be making to the market, and that way your investor understands that you're at least thinking about it in the right way. Maybe that's the first baby step, so you can start kind of filling that in. But one of the things you mentioned was clinician workflows. So I wanted to go to Jose a little bit to talk about the different ways. I see that a lot where people, one of the last things they think about, surprisingly, is how is that actually going to be used by the doctor or in the clinic or in the ER? And I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through some of the things you see around that.
So a brief story. I started my career doing atrial fibrillation ablations. These are procedures that were 2-3 hours just 10, 15 years ago, right? And so pretty quickly, I was not having dinner with my family, and I wanted to become more efficient. So the focus on workflow for me, it started 10, 15 years ago, and it was a desire to become more efficient. And as I progressed through that, I realized that I couldn't just focus on the procedure part itself. So it was on everything, how the lab is set up, how my technicians are going to prepare for the technology, how the hospital is going to incorporate new technologies. So this is to say that I see that today for big companies, the big strategics, workflow is the battleground for them as they're creating ecosystems for adoption of their technology. You have to think about workflow, because once it becomes behavior, how a physician does a procedure, it is a moat for them. For a startup, a little different, but now think about my story. If I'm doing a procedure very efficiently, it'll come with a new technology, I'm gonna think very carefully before adopting it if it's gonna disrupt my day. So for a startup, what I see, unfortunately, frequently today is a lot of problem-solution fit. You have a great, clinically excellent technology, but no product market fit. And where it breaks is indeed in the lack of consideration for the workflow until it's late. And what I think one should be doing, this is easily done, is early on understanding the friction where everything could break for your startup. And that process needs to be done with clinicians. At LSI, we met with 30 startups. Not one of them had clinicians in the founding team. So this presents a challenge for the startups, and I think it can be costly to have clinicians in your team early on, but there are ways to do this that are cost effective, including who you're going to partner for your capital and beyond just capital. But workflow today, it is core, and I think the other issue I see, some startups have a very narrow view of workflow. They're just thinking about one step in the procedure, and perhaps that's where mistakes can be made. If you're thinking of workflow as a technique of how I do one step in a procedure, you're gonna forget to think about things such as how do I get this technology in the hospital? Is the VAC committee gonna accept? What is the payment? If you come with a subscription model where my hospital doesn't like subscriptions, it's gonna be a challenge. Do you need to bring a new piece of equipment? So any part of how it's gonna be adopted and the entire friction mapping of that process needs to be done so that you find your wedge early on for clinical adoption.
Yeah, absolutely. I have medical devices of all sorts in my clients, but I get a lot of wearables. And so often, one of the things I find very interesting is they're so focused on the tech and making sure that they're getting, the right reading, that they treat all of the software as an afterthought. And then they'll come to me and say, we just want you to tell us whether or not our commercialization plan makes sense. Our XYZ doctor is going to actually use it. And I'll say, okay, well, what's your software workflow look like? Are they doing remote patient monitoring? And is the doctor logging into that? Is the nurse logging into that? Are you printing out a report? How does that part work? And they go, oh, we haven't done that part yet. Well, I can't help you figure out what your uptake is going to be if you're not working through the other side of the equation yet. So I think that's very important. I think the other thing you sort of touched on is all the different types of workflows there are. And I think that leads into my next question around, when you think about reimbursement and the health economics plays you're going to be making, a lot of people just think, I need a CPT code. but there are a lot of different types of codes out there and different ways that you can work through, whether it's a payer or provider that's providing the payments for your product. So Danielle, I was wondering if you could walk us through some of those different pathways that you can be considering when it comes to how you might get your device paid.
Sure. So, you have your traditional payer pathways. Obviously when everyone thinks about American payer, you think Medicare, Medicaid. That's probably the most obvious one. Covers huge number of people in this country. And then as you would typically think about the private commercial payers, the Aetnas, the Blue Cross Blue Shields, the Cignas, they are a separate bucket, but oftentimes they sort of look to Medicare, Medicaid to see if Medicare, Medicaid is going to take the lead on something, and then they'll adopt it. Now, that's not always true 100% of the time. Sometimes the commercial payers are the first ones to adopt, and then Medicare kind of follows after the fact. Now, those are the sort of traditional pathways when you think about insurance coverage. You have to typically have a CPT, or not a CPT code specifically, but you have to have a code. You have to make sure you're getting paid in a way that keeps your product and company sustainable. It's sort of like a tripart, it's like a stool if you think about it. Coding, coverage, and payment. So those are the three biggies that you really have to think about. And without one of those in the stool will inevitably fall over. I'm not gonna get into the nitty-gritty of that, but so that's, I'd say, the main payment pathway in this country. Now, there are other alternative pathways. So one other pathway that I think is actually underutilized to some extent are called Medicaid waivers. So Medicaid, it's a federal program, but each state has its own Medicaid program, and the state basically dictates how it's run. And there's something called a waiver that basically allows a state to ask the federal government for permission, basically, to adopt a program that might not necessarily fit neatly into a traditional bucket of healthcare. So a typical one that you might hear mentioned every now and again is a home and community-based waiver. So sometimes that will cover, and now for devices, I think that's more for devices that are consumer-facing. So things someone might use in their home, just for example. You might have an activity monitor in a home of someone who, for example, lives with an intellectually disabled adult who has a risk of eloping. So this technology might not be covered under, Aetna, or Medicare might not cover it, but under a Medicaid waiver, you actually can get payment for this technology that is benefiting the community, it's benefiting the patient, and it's really helping people. So, typically states they're looking for new technology, interesting technology that's really going to help benefit the community, it's gonna help save money, it's gonna help avoid hospital visits. So that's definitely a good pathway to look into if your technology is not one that necessarily might, again, fit in the traditional coverage or health insurance bucket. Other things, or I guess other vehicles, are things like HSAs and FSAs. Rather than thinking about whether it's reasonable and necessary under Medicare, or if it's approved or cleared by the FDA necessarily, it's more of an IRS-driven analysis. And I know people often brush those off because they're like, oh, well, it's relying on consumers paying out of pocket, and we're trying to avoid that because that tends to be a barrier. It's a little different because it's pre-tax dollars that are put into these accounts, so the cost is defrayed, and you are only allowed to use those dollars for certain medical and health-related expenses. So I had a client, actually, it was a breast milk chiller, a really interesting item, and she did not go down the typical pathway of commercial coverage, but she did get into FSA and HSA, and she actually found a pretty good market there. And she found that because people, it was a defrayed cost because of the tax savings, she said, I'm actually doing pretty well just through this vehicle. Obviously there's the traditional pathway, but if you think creatively, there actually are other options out there.
It's very interesting. I love that waiver you were talking about, because I actually hadn't heard of that. And one of the things I see a lot now are clients that come to me. I just had one the other week. They sent me a document and they said, okay, scope something based off of this. and I could tell that Claude wrote it for them. And they've learned so much about their coding and coverage through Claude. And, you know, people don't realize how much of that information is off, doesn't think of all the nuances, is missing opportunities. And, you know, there are so many opportunities to have AI lead you astray or not be creative enough for what you need. And so I think this is a good opportunity to encourage everyone to realize that you still need to use the experts to a certain extent. I see that happen also in the regulatory side of things, you know, people who accidentally push themselves into a PMA where they could get more creative about it. I think one of the things that, you know, when we talk about you need to do it early and you need to be thinking through all these things, it can slow you down later commercially, but you also, if you're being proactive about it, there are ways that you can speed up your pipeline to revenue. And a lot of that ends up falling into things like how you're planning out your clinical trials. So I was wondering, Angela, if you could walk us through some of the different ways that by being proactive, you can actually be speeding things up for your company, because time is money.
Time is indeed money.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I find that happens a lot with startups and founders is they have huge ideas. They want a device that can do 5, 6, 7 different things. And what I always try to do is find that focus. What is the first thing we can do? What is the first thing we can do to get revenue? Because if you focus on 5, 6, 7 things, it could take 5, 6, 7 years. Whereas if you pick the first one, to Josie's point, if you find some key opinion leaders, some clinicians, talk to them, what do they need? What do they want? Then that is the starting point. From there, you can do your regulatory strategy. What is going to be the classification? Is there an easy way in? Can we make it Class 1 exempt first and then add indications later? So it's all about, can we do Class 1 exempt? Will we have payers for Class 1 exempt? And then, can we add that other indication later on where it becomes Class 2, maybe needs a 510K, something like that. In terms of the clinical data, when you're collecting clinical data, if you have to do it pre-market, you want a one-size-fits-all study. Europe is tricky right now, as I'm sure you'll agree. In Europe, they need safety and performance objectives for everything. And what that really means is when you're designing a clinical study, it's not about the indication. Yes, we have an indication, we have what the device is intended to do, but we also need to have all these performance and safety measures as required by Europe so that you can then transfer that data into Europe. So what that really means is really very early on engaging with a regulatory clinical professional to help you design what that looks like. And some of it is really quite bizarre, frankly, because you're collecting things that you don't really know why you need to collect it. But it's trying to future-proof yourself so that once you've done a study, you can then use that study to get into Europe. I can't stress enough how awkward Europe is right now in terms of the data they expect you to collect. So it makes real good sense to plan that study with the future really in mind, because it can save you years and millions just to do that a couple of years earlier, just to make your study that little bit more complicated now will make it a lot simpler moving forward. Back to Josie's point on the key opinion leaders, that is absolutely critical. I've worked with companies who've gotten all the way, they've got a 510K, they figured out they needed reimbursement because quite often nobody thinks about that unless someone highlights it to them. And then they go out and they try and sell it. And the doctors say, I don't need that. What's that for? I can't use that. That's going to add time to my day. And all of that comes because they didn't engage with people like yourself really early on. And this doesn't need to be, you don't need to have a clinician on staff. This just means you need to get out there, you need to talk to people, you need to know who your key opinion leaders are. Because if you have a good product, the doctors will want to talk to you. You might have to buy them a sandwich, but they will want to talk to you to help you get there. And I think that is absolutely critical in the startup world.
Yeah, nice. And I think, when you talk about doing the clinical work, one of the things I've noticed has been a change in the last decade maybe is CMS doesn't always like foreign clinical studies because they're not sure on how it works through the clinical workflow side of things. So you also need to be planning towards that. I think there's a lot you can do in evidence plan generation to start front-loading some of that work and being strategic about it, but also understanding that you might not, most likely, can't just get away with one study that you submit to the FDA and it's going to cover everything you need for CMS, because those bodies both think very differently about what it is they want to see in a study. So you want to work through all of that. I think what would be interesting right now is, we all have a variety of clients that we work with, but I'd love to hear from each of you sort of what's your favorite, I'm happy to hear all the different work you do. I think we got a little bit at the beginning, but what's your favorite type of project or client that you like to work with? I know personally, I get really jazzed about product portfolio and the cadence and product pipeline, like what is a must-have in this first MVB product in order to get to market properly. But I do everything from that to getting people ready for a commercial launch. Danielle, what do you think is your favorite type of project or client to work with?
I really like the super early stage startups. There's something about the energy and the excitement that they have this product that they are so jazzed about, and it's often just an amazing product that I'm so excited to get them rolling on. And they're often undaunted by, surprisingly, you'd be surprised, by everything that I tell them. I mean, it's like drinking from a fire hose when you say, well, you have to think about this, you have to think about that, and blah, blah, blah. They just say, we got it. Like, we want to get this on the market. We want to help people, and this is how our device is going to help people, and we're just going to figure it all out. I just love that energy. So that's my personal favorite.
Yeah, very cool. And Angela?
I love the really early stuff too. The someone that comes and says, hey, I have an idea, and it's either a scrap of paper or sometimes a 3D printed prototype. Can you get that on the market for me next week? Love that. It's brilliant. It's so much fun. The other side of it is the clinician products. A lot of ideas come out of hospitals, they come out radiologists and anesthesiologists. They just figure out something that can make their life a little bit easier, and they come into this world of medtech as the users. But they've had this awesome idea and they're, okay, I've got this, what do I do now? That's the real fun. That's the good stuff.
Yeah, as long as they can afford to bring us on, I think. Jose and I were talking earlier about how a lot of times a startup is either a product looking for a place to implement, which is not a bad thing. They have something that works and could be implemented in 5 different ways, which is the best way for them. Or a group that starts with a problem that they need to solve and they're trying to figure out what tech to put into it. And I think at both ends of the spectrum are very interesting. Mercè, what about you?
Yeah, I really like as well working with, early stage products. Especially, we have a lot of projects where the companies want to know, do I go to Europe first or, FDA first? So you have to start drafting all these scenarios. And as Angela was saying, do we have the option to be maybe a class 1 exempt or a 510K versus a de novo? And then in Europe, we are a class A, class B, So I really like to start playing these scenarios as well. Also, when we have, our market access team working as well, you start drafting all these, strategies and brainstorming with the company, and then you end up with like a strategy that, will help this company to achieve compliance and put the product on the market. Yeah.
That does sound interesting.
Yeah.
Jose, what about you?
Yeah, I wouldn't even call it a fun project, but really my mission is to bring physicians' voices to startup ecosystem earlier and with more touch points and more frequently. And it's, Angela said great things about the model and the problems. I think more than just bringing one physician, one KOL, you got to bring mainstream physicians, or those that are doing these procedures in masses, in large numbers. Even bringing just one KOL or a KOL may be a problem. If you are a surgical device that requires extreme expertise and technique, you may have a very small fraction of the physician population that's going to be able to use. That's friction. That's an adoption challenge. So getting physicians' voices very early, and who you talk to, the types of physicians, a very heterogeneous group of physicians, different practice settings, career stage, interests into the startup ecosystem for advice and to help shape the product and find product market fit is what my passion is.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining me on stage. I know it says we've got a couple more minutes left, but I know we started a little late, so maybe we'll let them catch up on it. I think if we tried to do another round of questions, we might go over. So it's been really fun having you guys join me on stage. I hope you guys learned a little bit on how you can get proactive for preparing for commercialization and launch. It's really a complicated puzzle, and I think everybody on this stage, like me, really enjoys figuring out how to solve that puzzle. And so we love helping people with that. Thank you very much.